Reed versus Reed
by Jackie Gritton and Han Lee. Our thesis statement is, after the passing of their son Richard Reed in 1967, Sally and Cecile Reed were deciding who gets his estate. Cecile Reed inherited Richard's estate due to the Idaho probate code that specified males must be referred to females. In 1971, Warren Burger delivered this opinion to the U.S. Supreme Court, and it was a unanimous vote saying that the code violated the 14th Amendment. It also inspired many women's rights debates after it.
History of women's rights. Women have always been viewed less than men, and because of this, we've been discriminated against. As a result, we started the women's suffrage movement, 1848 to 1917, along with the women's rights movement, 1960 to 1980. These are social movements in the United States where women fight for equal rights and opportunities. Some examples of our achievements are: August of 1920, the 19th Amendment was passed by the U.S. Congress, and it granted all women the right to vote. In 1963, President John F. Kennedy passed an Equal Pay Act prohibiting sex-based wage disparity between men and women. In 1978, the U.S. Congress passed the Pregnancy Discrimination against Pregnant Women in Employment.
What is the Idaho probate law? The Idaho probate law manages the administrations of estates after a person's passing. The order of preference goes up to 11 classes. It is stated in the Idaho Code Section 15-312, Number 1, the surviving husband or wife or self-competent person whom he or she may request to have appointed. 2, the children. 3, the father or the mother. 4, the brothers. 5, the sisters. 6, the grandchildren. 7, the next kin entitled to share in the distribution of the estate, and etc. until it goes up to 11, anyone legally competent. Getting more specific, Idaho Code Section 15-314 states that males must be referred to females, and the relatives of the whole to those of the half-blood, giving men automatic preference over women violates the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment.
What was the cause of the case? The Reed family consisted of Sally Reed, her ex-husband Cecile Reed, their adopted son Richard Reed. Richard's parents, Cecile and Sally, separated when he was really young, prior to his death. During Richard's childhood, Sally had custody over him, but once he became a teenager, Cecile took custody. Sally was opposed to this. Just after Richard turned 19 years old, he committed suicide with his father's rifle. When Richard passed, he died without a will, leaving his parents to decide over who would receive what. Sally filled out an application to be appointed administrator of Richard's estate, finding out Cecile had filled out a competing application.
What happened? The probate court of Ida County appointed Cecile Reed the administrator of Richard's estate. Both parties were equally qualified under the father and mother title of the 11 classes, but in spite of this, Cecile was administrator because of the mandatory male preference specified in Idaho Code Section 15-314. Males must be referred to females. After this, Sally appealed the court order to challenge the Idaho Code Section 15-314 as unconstitutional and arbitrary and capricious. The Idaho Supreme Court rejected Sally's appeal, saying that the Idaho statute was reasonable because men are better qualified to act as administrators than women.
The decision. When Chief Justice Warren E. Burger delivered this opinion to the U.S. Supreme Court, they had a different conclusion. Sally Reed, the appellant, was joined by her lawyers Alan R. Durn and Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Cecile Reed, the appealee, was joined by Charles S. Scout and Myron E. Anderson. In November 2nd, 1971, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in favor of Sally Reed. It was a unanimous vote that the Idaho Probate Code Section 15-314 discriminated against women. It was a landmark case because it was the first case that talked about the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment for women. Ruth Bader Ginsburg labeled the case a turning point.
Impact of the case. The Reed versus Reed landmark case was greatly added to the women's rights debates. It opened the door to many cases that protected women's rights. It was the first case that ruled an unfair statute in violation of the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment to protect women's rights. Some cases that are about sex discrimination after this include the Roe versus Wade in 1973. This was a landmark case that protects a pregnant woman's rights to have an abortion without excessive government limitation. United States versus Virginia. In 1996, this case was about ruling the male-only policy for the Virginia Military Institute as unconstitutional with the help of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg.
Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Ruth Bader Ginsburg was born in Brooklyn, New York in 1933 and became the first Jewish female of the U.S. Supreme Court. In 1980, she was appointed by President Jimmy Carter the United States Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit. Then in the 1933, Ruth Bader Ginsburg became a U.S. Supreme Court Justice appointed by President Bill Clinton to fill Justice Brian White's seat. She used her voice as a justice to fight for gender equality and women's rights. She was a U.S. Supreme Court Justice until September 18, 2020, when she died at the age of 87 due to complications of metastatic pancreatic cancer.
End credits.